The fact is, male and female are different because, not because somebody imposed these roles on people. It's because the different size of gametes implies a different obligation to invest in offspring, which changes the entire spectrum of how you should think about your hazards and opportunities. And the easiest way to see this is to understand that inside of a plant, many plants have both male and female parts in the same individual. In the case that a flower has male parts and female parts, they disagree over how to view sex with a stranger. The fact is, the female parts are very skeptical of sex with stranger plants, and the pollen parts are enthusiastic about it. That's not for any reason other than the basic asymmetry in those gametes says that this is a sensible way to look at the puzzle. And it has been that way, apparently, for hundreds of millions of years. This has nothing to do with people, nothing to do with oppression. This is just basic biology. And if you don't understand that, you're not even in a position to enter this conversation.
Let me just fill in. I think you said it, but I'm not sure it's totally clear. Like, why should the male parts be enthusiastic about any sexual opportunity that comes around and the female parts not so much? It goes back to that big difference in the size of the gametes, that each, in the case of plants, grain of pollen cell is a tiny investment. Send that pollen out to whatever shows up in terms of eggs, and it's not a big cost. If that egg turns out to be a rogue egg or the egg of a plant that's not a very good match, it's not very much of a cost. Whereas the egg, in deciding, we're speaking anthropomorphically here, but in deciding whether or not to accept any given pollen grain, that egg is, for a cell, gigantic. It's already a big investment on the part of the plant, and so eggs are more choosy about what pollen or sperm to accept for fertilization than pollen or sperm is. And that's the gametes. The bodies they're in, the same is true. And there are exceptions. There are sexual reverse species. There is polyandry out there where, there's multiple male mates for a single female, but those are the exceptions. The fundamental original inequality in investment in what the sex gametes are, it directly translates into what the basic strategies are, male versus female.
And I would just point out that actually, if you follow this through, that in humans, we have software level adaptations, like, for example, monogamy, that change these basic parameters. When men and women are both investing long-term in partnerships that last a lifetime, in children that they will know and take care of, they become symmetrical in how choosy they are, right? Now, so this allows you to see, are men choosy about mates? Well, they're very choosy when they're looking for a life partner. They're much less choosy when they're looking for something to do for the evening. So that's exactly as you would expect it, based on this underlying biology of the asymmetry in investment that goes all the way back to a difference in gamete size that has nothing to do with people at all.
I mean, the thing that is so, as you were describing the difference in choosiness, I couldn't help but just think about the studies that have shown the radical differences on the swipe platforms, of which my life has been spared, thank the Lord in heaven. Where, the number of choices that a man will swipe, whatever the positive direction is, right, I don't even know, and say oh yeah, no, I like her. Women are many, many multiples more choosy on Tinder and all these platforms than men in comparison in all the studies I've seen about this. I know Chris Williamson talks about this kind of stuff all the time. I am thankfully long married and don't worry about it nearly as much. Monogamy. I want to get to monogamy because you spend time in the book, and it was an area that for your book represented the first time I really heard it through the evolutionary lens in a way that made a lot of sense.
I just want to point out that as much as this may all seem very abstract, you can understand these differences very simply if you think about what should a pollen grain that blows off of a tree and lands on a flower on some other plant do? Should it try to fertilize that other plant? It has exactly nothing to lose, right? It has landed on this other plant, it might as well. What should that female plant think? It should be skeptical, because another pollen grain might land that's better, and so it wants to know that that pollen grain is a good match. The asymmetry is right there. The guy trying to figure out what to do with his evening is different than the woman trying to decide whether to engage in a behavior that could constrain her for the next 18 years. And
therefore, of course, birth control changes the analysis.
Radically. It changes it profoundly. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's been a tremendous benefit in women being able to decide how to allocate their efforts and when to produce a family. That has been a major advance of civilization. But it undermined the basic logic that made things work before, which doesn't mean we should go backwards, but it means we should not be surprised that we are living in a world of sexual chaos, because we took away one of the fundamentals and we didn't pay very close attention to all the stuff that was connected to it.
Well, instead of encouraging more men to act like women at their best, it has encouraged more women to act like men at their worst. And encouraging either sex to act like the other sex at their worst is obviously not good for any of us.
So it's impossible to hear your description of the pollinators and the male and female plants and not immediately hear like the most stereotypical patterns of, men and women, especially, in their 20s. Why does that pattern survive into human culture in the 21st century? For all the things that are changing, it still does seem to be the case that, men and women behave differently and that they behave in ways that sure rhyme with the plants you're describing. So why is that?
In part, it's actually the reemergence of a pattern, because all of the cultural mechanisms for discouraging it have been removed. And that's, it was never gone, but in essence, for almost all of human history, the danger for women of being stuck with offspring and no help raising them was so profound that women themselves and women's families were incentivized to drive up the costs for men behaving badly. And the problem is that birth control lowered the stakes on sex itself, which then robbed the entire logic from the system of mating and dating, and in many ways the logic of civilization itself, because in the past it was not a simple thing for a man to find a woman willing to reproduce with him. He had to become worthy of that, and that drove men to accomplish many of the things that men accomplished. At the point that the stakes of sex get lowered, then the motivational structure of civilization is now radically altered. And that has not been a benefit for civilization. It has resulted in a lot of frivolous behavior, and it has resulted in a lot of experimenting with turning sex casual, which is not frankly good for almost anybody. It may be fun, but it does not actually serve men or women in the long run. It ends up producing a kind of hollow existence that many discover too late to do much about it.
Heather, how do you think about both like in the macro picture, but also personally, about this notion of gender roles and, the liberation of the pill and the way that changes? I mean, I've got to imagine it's complicated.
It is. And, we write into the book, and I've heard Bret say this a number of other times, as he just did, about the ways that not having to impress women in order to attract the attention of a good woman has demotivated men. And I've tried to figure out what the equivalent is on the female side. And, it goes a little bit in the opposite direction. right? Because the emancipation, frankly, that results from being freed from unwanted pregnancies, both from wanted sex and from unwanted sex, has opened up the doors for professional achievement that wasn't open for women, obviously, right? And so, neither of us has ever asked for a return to the olden days. This is not in any way a call for trad, right? Even though it is a recognition of what is far older than trad, far more fundamental in terms of the basic non-identity, like non-identicalism between the sexes. Again, because of what I already walked through with regard to what is downstream of the differences in gamete sizes. So I've said elsewhere, but for the fact of my natal family, I think never would have gone along with it. Had I been born 40 years later, there are definitely forces in the universe who would have told me I was trans. 100%, because yes, I had some traditionally feminine interests in terms of literature and music and museums and such, but I was also going to math competitions and digging in the dirt and building fences and playing sports, and I was more driven to those things. Those felt like more fundamental pieces of my identity, and the idea that the things that you are interested in change something more fundamental to what you are is it's both a bastardization of logic and a obviously decohering force at the moment in society. It's rare now to run into young people who are willing to say absolutely, like, no, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm definitely the sex that I was born. That's nuts. When we were professors, we had students who identified as and who we identified as trans. I still feel that at least a couple of those people are living the lives that are best for them, given the developmental experiences they had growing up, living as if they were the opposite sex. Some other number of those students were trying on a role. It was experimentation, which is what teenagers do, which is what young humans do across time and space. What wasn't true yet then, but which has accelerated in a way that I never could have predicted, was the widespread not just acceptance, but demand that everyone accept that what is fundamentally true about biology is not true. And it feels like this is one of the very few binaries that exists in biology. Sex is binary. There's not very much in biology that is binary. There's not very much that's actually rule-like, but sex is binary. And all the other things that we're arguing about in the culture wars are a little bit more complicated, actually. There are gray areas. This one, there's not, actually, right? If you're male, you're male, and if you're female, you're female. And yes, you can try to drag me into talking about intersex and into, developmental, disorders of sexual development and all of that. But those are exceptions, and this is binary. And honestly, this is exactly as fundamental as 2 + 2 = 4. This is really basic. And once we give up the things that are that basic, what left are we standing on? Like there's nothing left. So yeah, but then at a personal level, it also feels like this tremendous loss, because again, I think that my parents were such that they would have resisted. On the other hand, I grew up in LA. California is big on taking rights away from parents at the moment, in order to serve the whims of the state. And who knows what I would have been receiving in school. I was a good student. I questioned things, but I was a good student because it worked for me. So who knows what could have gotten into my head? I would like to believe that even growing up now with that family, I would have ended up being one of the ones who resisted, but I see a lot of good people who are not resisting, who have all of the opportunities and still don't resist. And it makes me very, very worried.
I would also just point out that we didn't know it at the time, but that your example says that we were kind of living at the apex of something important, right? You had the liberty to do whatever you wanted, and you did it, right? You didn't sacrifice the ability to have children, to have a marriage, but you also didn't sacrifice the ability to be successful in a career, in a science, which is traditionally a male realm. Not only that, but you worked in the field, you wielded a machete and wore rubber boots. And the point is, you decided which things you wanted, and there was no bar to you mixing them, and it didn't require surgery or drugs or anything like it. So, in some sense, the fact that that period ends with this, frankly, regressive notion that these sex roles are so limiting that you have to escape them with surgery or drugs is it is a tragic way to take the achievement of the liberation that was so real and to squander it on some sort of, at least a preposterous notion about how limited these things are.
Yeah. I guess I would add one more thing. There's been much made about how many fewer women there are in science, and that really what people need are the role models that look like them. And I'm not saying that can't be helpful, but it shouldn't be necessary, because how do you get started then? Like how does the person representing the demographic that doesn't yet exist in the thing get started if what you really need is to not be first? Doesn't make any sense. But it's also true that, of course, given what the sexes are and given what the history has been, that when you are a rarity as a woman in a field, you're more likely to run into things like harassment and such. And certainly that has existed. I think, through a combination of skill and luck, I never ran into that. I had a series of male mentors and some female as well, but my main mentors, beginning with my father, were extraordinary men who were good men who didn't expect the person with the skills and interests that I had to come in the package I was. My dad was expecting a boy. My major advisor, I was one of only 2 female students he ever had. We were colleagues at the time. We were friends with one another. And, we would joke with one another, like, Arnold doesn't necessarily know what to do with us, but he's not thrown by it. He's just, and I was the only one of his female students who was doing field work, like going off alone into the jungle and living for a long time alone in a tent. Like, obviously there's risks that are different there for a woman than for a man. Pretending that women and men are the same, which was kind of the version of feminism that was going on in the 90s, was foolish. And pretending that men can become women, or that if you want to go out into the field and work alone, then you must actually be a man and just be confused about what your sex is. Both of these are deranged versions of reality. So I was, again, some combination of luck and skill, had a series of male mentors who said, oh, cool, wasn't expecting that. Let's go. Like, let's work. I'm going to treat you. I'm not going to give you any breaks because you're female, and I'm not going to give you any handicaps. No handicaps in either direction. I'm not going to handicap you, nor am I going to provide you a handicap because of your sex. And yet we can also recognize that the risks in the field, the experiences that you've had, the questions you're likely to ask are going to be different. So that's one of the other things about science, especially in evolutionary biology, animal behavior. What the scientific method is supposed to do is reduce the bias sufficiently that the answers you get to the questions you've asked will be exactly the same answers that someone else gets if they ask exactly those questions in the same way. What the scientific method doesn't equalize, and makes no attempt to equalize and shouldn't equalize, is what questions you ask. And so the reason to want, for instance, diversity across sex and race and demographics in science is that different people with different experiences will have different interests. So I was interested long before I became a parent myself in the evolution of parental care and social systems and territoriality. And I was asking questions presumably in a somewhat different manner than you would have, right? Or that anyone else would have. But the answers that I got are hopefully exactly the same if I was doing the science right. So that too, like all the good mentors I had, female and male, could recognize, oh, cool question. I hadn't thought of that. Great. And maybe part of the reason you hadn't thought of that is because you're not me. You know, that's the individual component of what it is to do science that often gets lost when, when we're told that we must follow the science as if it's some, autonomous robot thing in the sky.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.